Now, some perspective on why the world despises the United States. Wars are so horrific, they should be defensive only. But these are all clear examples of how the US manipulates and manufactures consent for non defensive campaigns which intend to dominate, exploit, or ones that end up being extremely long occupations. Many US wars have been criticized for being offensive rather than defensive, often justified with questionable or outright false pretexts. These wars are frequently linked to geopolitical interest, economic gain, and the military industrial complex. Here are some of the most prominent examples of this. The Mexican War of 1846 through 1848. The pretext of this war claimed Mexican aggression over disputed border skirmishes. But what was the reality? The reality was the U.S. provoked Mexico to justify expansion under the Manifest Destiny. The war resulted in the U.S. annexing half of Mexico's territory, present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, and Texas. It makes you wonder why people think they have the right to call Mexican Americans immigrants, as if they don't belong here. They were here first. What were the motives? The motives were land, expansion of slavery, and economic gain. Another example is the Spanish-American War of 1898. The pretext of this was the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, blamed on Spain. The reality was there was no conclusive evidence that ever proved Spain's involvement in that explosion. It was likely an internal explosion. War fever was fueled by yellow journalism at that time, much like it still is today. The actual motives were imperial ambitions, which resulted in US acquiring the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. My next example will be the Korean War of 1950 to 1953. The pretext was the defense of South Korea against communist aggression. The reality actually was, while North Korea did invade, the US used the war to assert anti-communist dominance in Asia and test Cold War military capabilities. It evolved into a war of containment rather than self-defense. The motives: the containment of communism during the so-called Red Scare period. Some would argue that never disappeared because people continue to talk about communism. It's ridiculous. And the expansion of U.S. military footprint. The Vietnam War of 1955 to 1975. The pretext was the Gulf of Tonkin incident of 1964, where U.S. ships were allegedly attacked. The reality was the second attack never happened. The incident was manipulated to justify escalation. The motives were anti-communist intervention, military-industrial profits, and regional influence. The Gulf War of 1991. The pretext for this war was that Iraq invaded Kuwait. U.S. claimed to protect sovereignty and oil access. The reality was that though Iraq did invade Kuwait, the U.S. also saw a chance to reassert dominance in the post-Cold War order and protect oil interests. So the motives were oil, military dominance, and defense contracts, all part of the military-industrial complex. The war in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021. The pretext: response to 9/11, targeting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. What was the reality? This quickly morphed into a 2-decade occupation with nation-building goals. The Taliban was not responsible for 9/11. Al-Qaeda was. And the motives for this war? Military-industrial complex, of course. control over Central Asia, and rare minerals and pipelines. The Iraq War of 2003 to 2011. What was the pretext of this war? Well, supposedly they sold the public on this idea of weapons of mass destruction and links to Al Qaeda. The reality was no weapons of mass destruction were ever found. I actually served during this war. Saddam had no ties to 9/11. The war was built entirely on lies. The motives for this war was oil, regime change, military contracts, and poor power projection. The Libya intervention of 2011. The pretext for this was humanitarian intervention to protect civilians during the Arab Spring. A lot of bullshit. The reality? NATO bombings led to the collapse of Libya, massive civilian deaths, and open slave markets. You will see a trend that the United States meddling in all these other countries makes them way worse than they ever were to begin with. The motives for this? Regime change, oil, and geopolitical influence. Syria, ongoing since 2011. Yes, it is still a mess there, mostly thanks to the US. The pretext for this conflict? Support for rebels and opposition to Assad's brutality. The reality? US funded extremist groups helped destabilize the country and used the war to push back Iranian-Russian influence. The actual motives for this war? Geopolitical power, Israel's regional security, and energy pipelines. Some other conflicts that should be noted would be Panama of 1989, which the US claimed Noriega was a threat. Invasion was more about US control over the Canal Zone and showing off post-Cold War power. Grenada of 1983. This conflict was justified as protecting US medical students. In reality, it was a Cold War power flex. Dominican Republic, 1965. Intervention framed as preventing communism, but it was about crushing a nationalist movement. So you see the trend here. These wars often began under false or exaggerated pretexts, served economic or imperial interest, fueled defense contractor profits, and expanded U.S. global military reach, not actual homeland defense. One should scrutinize any war the U.S. tries to drag our country into in the future, because you can guarantee that it isn't about defense. It is about enriching the elite who rarely pay taxes, putting most of the tax burden on the struggling working class. It is most likely about regime changes, exploitation of people and their natural resources in their country. And this isn't something that our people should be sent to fight and die for. And it for sure should not be supported to murder and slaughter innocent civilians in other countries. Thanks for listening.